Hey guys, welcome back to another video on Microsoft Orleans. This is probably going to be one of the last videos in this series, and we're just going to look at some small optimizations we can make in our system. Specifically, we're going to look at one-way requests and how we can use cancellation tokens with Microsoft Orleans to cancel work that is long running. We're not really going to do much theory around these, we're just going to get straight into the implementation. So if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the notification bell to be updated for future videos, maybe in this series if we do a second part, or in other topics around distributed application development. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is one-way requests. And usually when we call a grain in Orleans, we wait for it to return to us. So we await a task, and that will allow us to handle any errors or use the response from the grain. In the case of one-way requests, we are essentially firing and forgetting. So we're saying, hey, this grain, do some work. I don't care if you throw an exception. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to know about the response type. I don't want any of that. I just want you to do something, and whether you fail or not, I don't really mind. In fact, Orleans doesn't even guarantee that the grain that we're calling actually even receives the request. So when we're using this, we need to be obviously quite careful, and it's really only appropriate in scenarios where we don't really care if the grain doesn't succeed in 100% cases. We just want it to be slightly more performant than the usual grain call. So let's go ahead and look at how we might want to implement this in our banking application. So we'll go to our grains and we'll go into our abstractions and our checking account grain. And let's just add another interface method here for our one-way call. So we'll just call it fire and forget work. We don't need to pass any parameters to it, but what we do need to do is we need to just mark it as one way. So that tells Orleans that this is a one-way method call, it's a one-way request. That's really the only difference between this method and any other methods. The implementation on the actual grain is pretty much the exact same. So let's go to our checking account grain and let's implement that method. So at the bottom, we have this fire and forget work. And what we might want to do here is to simulate receiving a request, doing some work, but then it failing. We might await a timer. So say task.delay time span from seconds. So we're going to wait for 2 seconds essentially, and then we're going to throw an exception. So we'll throw a not supported exception, and we'll just say this work cannot be done. So what would happen when we're calling this as a normal non-one-way request would be that the client would call the method, it would await the task that returns, it would await that for around 2 seconds, and then the task would return and it would have the exception on it, and we would handle that exception. But in the case of a one-way request, the client, as soon as it called this method, it just forgets about it. This method itself waits 2 seconds and then throws an exception, but the client no longer cares about that exception. So the client doesn't know that this method failed. So that's basically it from our grain point of view. Let's go into our client and add a new HTTP endpoint to just call this kind of fire and forget work and just see, does it behave the way we expect it to. So we're doing it on our checking account. So let's go down to our checking account and we'll just copy the post from the recurring payment, but instead of recurring payment, we'll just call it fire and forget work. We still need the checking account ID. We don't need the create recurring account payment. And we need to get the grain still. And instead of calling add recurring payment, we're just going to call fire and forget work. We don't need to pass any parameters to that. And we'll just return no content. So what we're expecting here is that every time we call this method, we're expecting a successful response code. If it wasn't a one-way request, because we're not handling the exception in the call itself, we might expect to return a 500. So let's boot this up and see what happens when we call this in Postman. Okay, so we're in Postman here, and we have our method fire and forget work. And of course, I will put this collection in the video description, and don't forget that the code for the whole banking system is available on my GitHub. Again, I will leave that link in the description. So let's call this checking account endpoint. But before we do that, actually, let's create a new checking account to make sure we have the correct ID. We'll copy the ID from the response header and we'll put it into our fire and forget work call. Okay, so we send this and we see we get a 204 no content straight away. So even though we know it throws an exception after 2 seconds in the code, we still, from the client point of view, see that successful. So let's make a really small change. Let's go back into our system. Let's remove that one-way request attribute on our interface. So let's delete this here and let's just restart our cluster. Okay, so now that our cluster is restarted, let's just call this method again and see what happens. So we call it, we can already see it's taking longer than it did before. And we can see, as we expect, in this case, it returns a 500 because the client is now waiting for that task to be returned from the silo. So it knows about this exception that occurred on the method on the grain. Okay, so let's just add the one-way attribute back on that request. And next we're going to just simulate some cancelable work on our grain. So say in the case where we make a grain call, it runs some long running work that we might want to cancel after a certain amount of time if we no longer want the work to be performed. And this is done in a kind of very similar way to how just normal cancellation tokens work in C#. So if you don't know much about cancellation tokens and you're confused by this, just check out maybe a couple of videos or some documentation on .NET cancellation tokens because they operate very similar to how they do in Microsoft Orleans. There's only one slight difference really, is that we're using a grain cancellation token instead of the raw cancellation token itself. So for our method, let's just add a task returning cancelable work method. And that's going to take a couple of parameters. The first is going to be that grain cancellation token. And the second, we're just going to simulate long running work by passing a value that determines how long we're going to be doing the work for. So work duration seconds. So if we pass 10 seconds here, or the 10 rather, we're going to do work for 10 seconds. If we pass 20, we're going to work for 20 seconds. And then if we jump into our checking account grain, we want to go ahead and implement this interface method. So now we should have our cancelable work method here. Let's start by making it async. And what we want to do is we just want to add a try catch block. Instead of catching an exception, we're going to catch a task cancelled exception. So that will allow us to catch in this catch block when the work is cancelled. And rather than just throwing that, we're just going to return to the client. We could throw here and it would return a 500 if we're not handling that on our client. But just for simplicity, we'll just return here. And then in our cancelable work, we're actually going to perform our work in the try block. So we're going to say await task.delay, and we're going to do our delay for time span from seconds, work duration in seconds. And then we're also going to pass in the cancellation token into this task.delay as well. So we're going to say grain cancellation token dot token or cancellation token. So that's all we need to do here really, is just to simulate some long running cancelable work using task.delay, catch the task cancel exception and return it to the user. So let's go into our program CS on our Orleans client and we'll add a endpoint to call this cancelable work. So we'll start by just copying our fire and forget endpoint here. So instead of fire and forget work, we'll just call it cancelable work. And in here, we want to get the checking account grain. We don't want to do this fire and forget work. What we want to do is something slightly more complicated. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create this grain cancellation token source. And a grain cancellation token source, much like a cancellation token source, is what we use to get the cancellation token, but also what we use to cancel the work. So we're just going to say var grain cancellation token source is equal to new grain cancellation token source. Perfect. And just delete this V. So once we have that, we can then call to do the work on the grain itself. So we'll just call this grain call task. And what we want to do is we want to call on the checking account grain. We want to call that cancelable work endpoint. We want to pass it in the grain cancellation token source dot token. So the token itself from the source, and also a work duration. So for in our case, we're just going to say 15. So for 15 seconds, we're going to do this work. And note here that we're not actually awaiting this. we're just getting the task here. So this will allow us to also cancel the task, as we'll see in a second. So we're going to create a second task, and we're just going to call this cancel work task. And we're going to say async inline function. We're going to delay for a small amount of time. So this is where we're going to say, hey, I want to delay until I cancel the work for a certain amount of time. So time span from seconds, 5. So we're going to delay for 5 seconds. And then on the grain cancellation token source, we're just going to call it cancel. So essentially what we're doing here is we're creating 2 tasks. One to run the cancelable work on the grain, which will take 15 seconds to run. And another task that after 5 seconds will call cancel on the grain cancellation token source, which will then cancel the work that's being performed in the cancelable work method. So the final thing we want to do is we actually want to await these 2 tasks. So we'll do await task.when all, and we'll pass the 2 tasks, so the grain call task and also the cancel work task, which we'll call here. So that will mean that this will then return when both of these tasks are done. And in our current configuration, this grain call task will complete after 15 seconds unless it's cancelled. This cancel work task will complete after 5 seconds, but it will also cancel the grain call task. So what we're expecting is that this will take roughly 5 seconds to run and it will cancel the work here. So let's jump into Postman and let's call this endpoint and let's see, does it do what we expect? So let's start our cluster first. And once that's successfully started, let's go into Postman. I've added this endpoint for cancelable work, and we're using the same ID that we used for the fire and forget work. So let's send that. We can see it's taking a little bit of time to run. Hopefully now it'll return after about 5 seconds. We can see we actually hit the exception in Visual Studio. So we'll pass over that and return, and in around 10 seconds in this case, because we stopped on the breakpoint, but if we run it again, we won't stop because I've turned off that. It should return in about 5 seconds this time. And as we expected, 5.03 seconds. So that means the work has been cancelled after 5 seconds. So let's go back into our program, into our call, and let's do something a little bit different. Let's actually not cancel the work in this case. So let's comment that out and remove the cancelable work task from our when all. Let's restart our cluster. Let's run it again. And in this case, we're expecting the work to take 15 seconds because that will be how long it takes for the work to be fully completed because we're no longer canceling it. So back in Postman, we'll call this here. I can edit this out. I'm sure people don't want to wait around for the full 15 seconds, but when it completes, we should see time 15 seconds or 15.03 or something quite small here. Okay, so that's completed. It took 15.26 seconds because in this case, we didn't cancel the work that the silo and the grain was performing. So thanks for watching this video. Just kind of 2 small optimizations around one-way requests and cancellation tokens that people might find useful when using Microsoft Orleans. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There might be more videos on Microsoft Orleans. I'm not 100% sure. There's a couple other topics I would like to cover maybe in the future around deploying and around some of the cool event sourcing stuff that Orleans also provides. So if you're interested in them or you're interested in other topics around distributed application development, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like the video and hit the notification bell to be updated when the new videos go up. Thanks everybody.